Hey, it's time for another Collection Connection, the game that's just an excuse to talk about records. This past Monday, over on the Plastic Soundwave Cult channel, my brother Plastic Eric discussed Upstairs at Eric's, the 1982 debut album from Yazoo. Even though they were known as Yaz in the US, my brother and I lived in England when this album came out, and through their entire brief run, in fact, so I've come by the name Yazoo honestly, and I've stubbornly continued to call him that for 42 years, despite being in America for the last 40 of them. I feel like there's a lot to say about this record, and once I've done that, I'll connect it to a seemingly unrelated album from my own collection that shares something in common with it. Today, that'll be the third album by a stalwart from the Aussie music scene, Paul Kelly, with his 1986 release, Under the Sun. Then stay tuned for an announcement at the end of the video. Anyway, the challenge that we issue to you is to work out the facet, quirk, or piece of trivia that they have in common from the information given over the course of the video, and then to put that guess in the comments, where the first correct answer will receive a shout out in my brother's next video. But first, let's officially reveal the connection between the prior pair of albums, those being Veronica Falls, the debut self-titled album from Veronica Falls, and Yazoo, Upstairs at Eric's. And the connection is more with the band than with the specific album, and that is that each band had just a short 2-album run, with Yazoo having Upstairs at Eric's and You and Me Both in 1982 and 1983 respectively, and Veronica Falls having Veronica Falls and Waiting for Something to Happen in 2011 and 2013. So they just had 2 albums, studio albums apiece, short runs, just a couple of years, and that was the connection, but nobody got it, so the point goes to us. And with that, we can move on with the episode. Okay, so Upstairs at Eric's, the Yazoo album, a classic in my estimation. Here's my original copy right here on CD. Judging by what Eric said in his video, I think I've maybe had it a little longer than he has, although I didn't get it clearly not on CD in 1982, but I had it, I think, in the 80s. So, although he said his was around 88, so maybe it's close to that time. But I've been a real Vince Clarke head since early Erasure. The duo of Vince Clarke and Andy Bell has been going on for decades now, so it was interesting, his early career with starting out with Depeche Mode, just doing 1 album with Depeche Mode, doing 2 albums with Alison Moyet as Yazoo, doing a brief, I think not much more than a single or 2, with Feargal Sharkey as The Assembly. Vince Clarke was kind of rapid fire going through different bands, collaborations, things like that before he settled on Erasure with Andy Bell, which he's now been doing for 40 so years. But I remembered the Yazoo tracks from being on Top of the Pops back in the 80s when we were in England, and Only You is a song that I have loved since that time. The other kind of big single, which is Don't Go, is a good jam, dance floor jam, but It's Only You is really a song that takes that simplistic, it's almost too easy sounding a song, but with Alison Moyet's vocals on it, feels really sort of heartfelt, and it's one of those songs, it feels like it was made for John Hughes montage, a song like Thompson Twins, If You Were Here, one of these kind of gentle, synthy, but still sort of heartfelt songs, and it's been a favorite of mine for 40 years now. And so I really like that song, but the rest of the album, with the exception of I Before E, Except After C, as Eric mentioned, which to me is just sort of a sound collage and indulgent, and I don't know, like Revolution 9, those things, they just feel like an indulgence to me. I don't care for them that much. I don't think they're that interesting. So that goes on a little long. Wish it didn't have that on it. I'm surprised that they dropped the song Tuesday and not that song when they decided to add Situation to the American version of the album. And that whole thing is an interesting situation because Situation was the B-side of Only You, but Situation is the song that caught on in the US. It was kind of the most significant track in the US for the band and became a big dance club, number one dance club hit in the US, but was never actually issued as a single in the UK. It was only ever the B-side for Only You. And then around 6 years ago now, they put together a package called Four Pieces, originally in its LP format, but three pieces as a CD version that is frustratingly incomplete because it has both of their two albums, Upstairs at Eric's and You and Me Both. They did have one non-album single, whose name I'm already losing, and then Situation, which was on the US version but not on the original UK version. These used the original UK versions of the album, and then for some strange reason, even though they have additional, a third disc here, two additional two additional vinyl discs on the LP version, they chose not to include Situation or the other non-LP single, even though they do have State Farm, which was the B-side for that other single, here in a remix form. And they have Situation three times, two different remixes, and one like a Peel session or a David Jansen session, kind of an equivalent of BBC session from 1982, but they don't have the original track. So in those situations, I know people have different reasons that they collect albums for. I'm a song guy, so I'm not about pressings or different album covers or this and that. I'm about the songs. And so when I re-buy an album, it frustrates me greatly when there are songs on a previous edition that I have that don't make it onto the new edition. I think I even complained about this specific thing a couple of weeks ago with Yazoo, that I feel like I gotta then keep my original edition around because it has Situation. It's the only one that I have Situation on, and this is even a more significant hit than or significant track than often is the case with those kind of things. So I get frustrated when it's not on there, but it's a great album to revisit. I had never bought You and Me Both before getting this sort of, not quite box set, but whatever you want to call it, collection of their two albums together. So I'm not as familiar with the second album. And it was interesting to me that the second album was the one that hit number one in 1983 in the UK. Upstairs at Eric's hit number two. They kind of charted in the lower reaches of the top 100 in sort of albums and singles in different things in the US, except for on the dance charts where they did go to number one with Situation. So they weren't as big in the US, but they did make it in the US. You know, they broke sort of immediately, which was not always the case with bands like this. And it was so interesting to me to know that Vince Clarke had the song basically Only You. And when he was going to leave Depeche Mode, he even offered that sort of as an olive branch. Say, hey, I got this song, you guys want to record that? I'm not trying to leave you high and dry. I just don't want to do this particular thing anymore. It's not going in the direction I thought it was going to go. They turned it down, and I guess the more he listened to it, the more he thought he wanted a female vocal on it. And so he knew Alison Moyet. She had a low profile. They'd gone to school together. She had a low profile music career, had been in some bands and stuff, but he wanted that voice on. And so they recorded that single and put that single out, and the success of that single led to, very quickly, within a couple of weeks, them putting together a full album. And so the immediacy of Yazoo was remarkable almost, just how quickly something like that could turn around. To go from an idea, to a demo, to a single recording, to a release, to, being signed, have an album, and a number 2 album at that, to become a successful act within a matter of months, and to be picked up on immediately in the US and other countries as well. They're like, hey man, come play shows here. And I don't know what it was that soured Vince Clarke, I think, specifically on it. I think Alison Moyet would have continued in Yaz fairly happily. She contributed songs, she wrote, so she wasn't just the voice by any stretch of the imagination. She was an integral part of this partnership, but I think in the same way that Vince Clarke wanted out of Depeche Mode, he wanted out of Yazoo, and even though they made a second album, they didn't really do it together. He would record music parts in the day, she would come in the evenings and record her vocals, and it already felt sort of checked out, and she was aware of how checked out sort of Vince Clarke was. So in a way, it's impressive that he finally found that collaborator that he wanted to work with for decades and decades with Andy Bell and Erasure. But I've been a lifelong fan of Vince Clarke. I love that early synth music that is more programmed than played on synthesizers, and so it takes a lot of, they don't really play chords, there's lots of arpeggios, and like that is the basis that Only You is built on, is a series of arpeggios. And just I don't know, I think that's like one of those perfect singles. I really love Only You. Yeah, I probably talked about that enough, so with that, let's go on to The Connection, which today is the 1986 album Under the Sun from Paul Kelly and the Messengers, or Paul Kelly and the Colored Girls, which is what it was released under in Australia. He had his initials album. He was another one who had been in bands. His first solo album was called Post, I believe, and that didn't necessarily do great, but he kind of clawed his way back in with a new backing band that, in tribute to Lou Reed's Walking the Wild Side, where the Colored Girls go do 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 do. That part, he called his backing band the Colored Girls, and kind of understandably, even in the 80s, other places around the world weren't all that comfortable with it, and so in the US it was released as Paul Kelly and the Messengers, and after those couple of albums as Paul Kelly and the Colored Girls in Australia and New Zealand, basically the antipodes down there, is the only place that it was ever released under that name. Even down there, they became Paul Kelly and the Messengers for a couple more albums before he just started releasing albums as just Paul Kelly. But if you're eagle-eyed, you will notice that this one is in fact Paul Kelly and the Colored Girls, and that's because I picked it up in Australia. It was a cassette that I had as Paul Kelly and the Messengers. It was a song, the track Dumb Things, which opens the album. Kicks off with a real sort of London Calling type of riff, and I love that song. They would play it on 120 minutes. I loved it then. I still think it's a great track, and it's a bit misleading as a song, because it feels in retrospect, hearing the whole album, like the song, you hear sometimes stories about putting albums together, like the song that they identified as the potential hit single, and so like a third of the budget goes into the one song. Those kind of situations, I don't know that that's what happens, but it feels much more full and rounded out to me than much of the album. It feels a lot more kind of stripped down and simple and not super fancy arrangements. Whereas this feels like they brought in muscle, there's harmonica on it and stuff like that. But I bought it on cassette back when it came out, and then bought it on CD when I took a trip in 1997 with my wife down to Australia. Went to a record store, bought a couple of things, among them this original Australian edition of Under the Sun, which has a couple more tracks on it than the American version had. So that's why I bought it. Again, I'm a collector of songs, so it included the songs Bradman and Pastures of Plenty. I can understand why they didn't include the song Bradman or Bradman. That's the name of a cricket player who's like a legend in Australian cricket. Americans aren't going to know who the crap that is, so they don't care. And so they didn't include the song, as well as Pastures of Plenty. So they just made it a couple tracks shorter, and I think maybe played with the track listing a little bit. But clearly, I like the album enough to buy it again, even though it falls into kind of a weird territory. As much as I love Dumb Things, and it feels like it's a song about sort of optimism and naivete, I guess, from a very jaded, older, more cynical view, kind of looking back at when you were young and when you thought, I don't know, things would turn out better than they ended up turning, and sort of derisively talking about, oh yeah, I did this. I thought that thought my friends would have my back. I thought, all I had to do was sing and I'd be famous. These kind of notions, and just the bitterness that kind of drips through the song Dumb Things is more like what I consider just a song. It's got a subject, but it's a song about a feeling. Much more than that, I think Paul Kelly is a storyteller, and in that way he's like Bruce Springsteen, and the songs don't necessarily, the musical tracks don't mean quite as much. They're not there to sound bad, but they're not necessarily super hook driven. They're just kind of backing tracks. Lloyd Cole from England is another one who's like that, who's more about the lyrics and the songs. The musical backing doesn't sound bad, and sometimes they still have hooks, but it's not about the hooks. The hooks aren't what are going to bring you to the picnic. It is the lyrics and the stories. And so he's much more of a storyteller in songs like 40 Miles to Saturday Night. You can even hear it in the title. Is very much like a Bruce Springsteen song. And To Her Door is another story song that you could line up, as a Bruce Springsteen track pretty easy. And they're good songs, and they're well-told stories, very precise with the lyrics, just kind of setting a scene very quickly, kind of creating a story about characters. Another one like that is Bicentennial, which is like the story of a soldier. So that even kind of has an analog to, the actual track Born in the USA, this kind of bitter soldier story who's come back, and is still sort of, I don't know, he's changed by the war, but people don't want to know it and don't want to hear about it, and other people didn't come back. And so, it's that kind of story song, but kind of from an Australian point of view, so instead of being out of New Jersey, he's, out of Australia and likes to tell these story songs. And the story songs are pretty good, and they're actually better when I re-listened to it here in the last couple of days than I even remembered. The bits that stick out in my memory. There's a track called Don't Stand So Close to the Window, another kind of story, a guy who's maybe involved in a relationship that he shouldn't be, and he's telling her, don't stand close to the window where somebody might see you. That kind of thing, but it has a sort of a violin track that is clearly, a synthesizer, is clearly a keyboard that makes it feel that much more thin, and again, feels like, all the production kind of went into Dumb Things, the production budget. But that doesn't make it a bad song by any stretch. I think that they're good songs, but they're simple, they're not crazy, hook-filled songs. And my experience with Paul Kelly, I bought another Paul Kelly and the Messengers album in comedy, one that came out later. It's got a couple of great story songs on there, from Little Things, Big Things Grow, and my personal favorite song from him, which is I Can't Believe That We Were Married. And that's a devastating song that is not presented in a devastating way. It is one of his catchier songs, but it's got this line, and the years have changed even the sound of your name, as somebody who you're dealing with. And it's like the kids, every so often you see each other because of the kids, and they don't even have animosity anymore. It's just weird to think that this is a person who was in your daily life, or somebody who you were married to, and when enough years pass, they're still in your life, they're still in your circle, but they've edged further and further out. You know, they used to be right in the nucleus of your life, and now they're just kind of a moon or a comet that passes by, you know, periodically, and it's just such a devastating song. It's a great track. Definitely recommend looking for that. But I guess that's not the album that we're talking about. We're talking about Under the Sun. And so after, yeah, I guess I just said that. And the other one that I have is Paul Kelly, Words and Music, which even the sort of the bland title of it didn't resonate with me nearly as much, and that those ended up being the only 3 albums of his that I bought. That's one that came out while I was working at Borders, and so it was there in the store, and I thought, ooh, Paul Kelly. I've liked those other 2 albums that I have of his. Haven't really kept up with him, so I bought that one, but it didn't floor me, and I didn't end up buying any more of his stuff. I know he did a thing with Neil Finn, I think in the early 2010s, where they toured together, and maybe Paul Kelly played some Neil Finn songs, and Neil Finn played some Paul Kelly songs, but I haven't really experienced that. I know they even put out an album, but I am unfamiliar enough that I don't even know if it was studio recordings or if it was a live recording called Going Your Way, I think. That was Neil Finn and Paul Kelly. So he's definitely, you know, a name for somebody who you might not have heard of in the U.S. or in the U.K. possibly, but he's definitely been around for decades in Australia, and I think this is a good record. I'm almost positive that there's something that I was going to say that I am forgetting. So I would recommend it if you like that kind of thing. It's funny, I'm not a Bruce Springsteen fan at all, in part because the gruffness of his voice annoys me, and sort of the blandness of those backing tracks doesn't do anything for me. But yeah, it's very much, I feel it's very analogous to Springsteen. So if that is your thing, you might like you some Paul Kelly. This is as good a place to start as any. Under the Sun, his 3rd record from 1986. So I will throw this over to Eric. He will find a connection to it in his collection. Talk about that on Monday. But in the meantime, we do have an announcement, and that is next week will be the last week that we do a Monday and Thursday episode. We have come to accept that we are not going to become kings of YouTube or anything like that. Been doing this for almost 4 years now, and my audience hasn't grown basically at all in those 4 years. We're not necessarily looking to take over YouTube. Our views kind of are what they are. They're super, super modest, but the amount of effort that goes into making a video every week doesn't seem commensurate necessarily with what's coming out of it. And so I have a lot of stuff going on. Eric would like to make other videos, and so in order to free that up, we are going to start putting out Collection Connections on Tuesday, but just every other week, or every week, but one week will be Eric, next week will be me, next week will be Eric, the next week will be me. So we will effectively be each putting out a video every 2 weeks in order to maintain a 1-a-week schedule. So that will be starting on Election Day in the U.S., actually, November 5th, I believe that is. And so that'll be, yeah, first Tuesday in November, we're switching to 1 video a week. Give you more time to guess, more time to take it in. It'll give me and Eric more time to think about and make the videos, maybe make other videos, and think about other things, and put things together a little more carefully. There's so much about these albums that I talked about today, Upstairs at Eric's and Under the Sun, that as I was thinking about them in the last couple of days, I feel like if I had a chance to kind of write it down into something a little more cohesive rather than just spouting shit off the top of my head, that it could be a much tighter and much more interesting video. So I would like to give myself a chance to do that. I forget the famous person who said, I would have written less, but I didn't have the time. That's kind of how I feel about it. I would like to tighten down my talking, keep the videos around 10 minutes if at all possible, but have it thought out enough that I actually manage to say everything that I'm thinking of when I go in. And this will give me the time to do that, hopefully, so that will be better videos for you. It'll be more time to live our life for us, but that will be coming in November. So thanks for listening to that. And yeah, you can look for Eric's connection to Paul Kelly and the Messengers Under the Sun on Monday. So you can look forward to that. And with that, that's all I have. So I thank you for watching. Bye-bye.